Well, hello, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We may have people coming in the next minute or two, but I think we can go ahead and get started. We have the full hour. My name is Dominic Tarpey. Welcome to all of you to today's Intensive Services Grand Rounds here at the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here in San Francisco. And I'm very pleased to have our topic today, and our speaker, Shane O'Neill Hart, is our speaker, and he's presenting today about compassion science and compassion-focused psychotherapy. And I'm very happy because Shane has presented at these grand rounds before, and we have been colleagues before here at Langley Porter at UCSF. And so I'll just quickly introduce Shane and then turn it over to him. Just from a housekeeping standpoint, as I think everyone knows, feel free to use the chat function in Zoom. And then Shane might have some thoughts as to how to interact as the hour goes on. And so Shane O'Neill Hart is the Senior Clinical Manager in the Mental Health Coaching Program at Lyra Health. That's his current role. And he is also a private practitioner and serves on the board of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Sciences, and he's vice president with that organization. Prior to his current role at Lyra Health, he was here at UCSF in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and specifically at Langley Porter in the partial hospital and intensive outpatient programs as a primary clinician. And so Lyra Health's gain was our loss, but I'm glad that he is back with us. He did complete his training and master's in social work at Boston College back east. And gosh, I think I'll just leave it at that and turn things over to you, Shane. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dom. Happy to be here. Thanks for the introduction. And hi, everyone. Nice to see all of you. I'm going to start by presenting. I need to share my screen first. And we'll go ahead and jump in. Can everyone see that and hear me? Great. So the topic, as Dom mentioned, is the science of compassion, drawing on mindful self-compassion and compassion-focused therapy. And just to introduce myself again, I'm Shane O'Neill Hart. My current role is at Lyra Health, but I'm also a social worker and a psychotherapist and a trainer, particularly in acceptance and commitment therapy. So you might wonder why I'm presenting on compassion. I'll explain that. As Don mentioned, I worked at UCSF at San Francisco General and then at Langley Porter and now at Lyra Health. And in terms of disclosures, I have no conflicts. I am employed by and paid by Lyra Health, but this presentation isn't about Lyra. It's about evidence-based practice that is open source and widely accessible. And another disclosure of sorts, so to get into why am I presenting on this topic, I don't necessarily hold myself to be an expert in compassion-focused therapy or mindful self-compassion. I come from an acceptance and commitment therapy background. That's really what my expertise is. But I've done some training in CFT. I've done a mindful self-compassion course a few times at this point. So coming at the lens of learning about compassion from an ACT perspective. And what I think is useful about this presentation is that it really represents kind of my journey of learning about the science of compassion. And it's an opportunity to kind of bring you into that while also presenting stuff that I think is going to be really useful clinically as well. So it's meant to be a pretty experiential presentation. So I encourage you to stay engaged, stay present, and to participate. And in terms of questions, feel free to drop questions into the chat. If they're relevant to what I'm talking about, I'll try to answer them in real time, or we'll leave some time at the end for longer questions, or if you want to come off mute. So let's jump in and start off with a kind of accessible definition of compassion, simply defined as the acknowledgement of suffering plus the commitment to alleviating it. And as you're thinking about this really basic definition, I'll encourage you to think about the role of mindfulness. You can't bring alleviation to suffering if you're not first able to acknowledge that it's present. So just an example of this, if I'm giving this presentation in front of a bunch of people and I'm feeling anxious, and I want to practice self-compassion as part of that. The first step is really noticing my threat system is activated. I'm feeling fear and anxiety in this moment. And then what am I going to do about it? And so we're going to talk a lot about different ways to respond to suffering. But the first step is really to notice that it's there. And I'll also just make a comment here on the fact that everybody in this group here has, for some weird reason, chosen to enter a profession where you choose to bring yourself into contact with suffering, like more than you would. All humans encounter suffering as part of life, but for some reason you've chosen to do something where you bring yourself into contact with it more than you need to or otherwise would if you had a different profession. And it's kind of an interesting, curious thing, like why would you choose to do that? But before we get too deep into the content on compassion, I want to talk about the evidence. So the main approaches that I'm going to be talking about today, or the ideas that I'm talking about, are drawn from compassion-focused therapy, mindful self-compassion, compassionate mind training, and compassion cultivation training. And I'm definitely more familiar with the first two than I am with the second two. And all of these have some degree of evidence that they're helpful, that they reduce psychological suffering. And then there's also quite a body of research showing that other approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy, even though they're not explicitly rooted in compassion, also lead to increased self-compassion. So compassion-focused therapy is kind of the one that has the most randomized control trials around it. And it has a handful of them for different things like psychosis and depression, but doesn't necessarily have enough research to meet the APA strict definition of an evidence-based treatment, but I think it's well on its way. And the research does show that it's a beneficial supplement to other treatments and may be particularly useful to clients who rate high in shame and self-criticism. And that was kind of the origin of compassion-focused therapy in particular, is that there were some clients who didn't respond well to traditional CBT, who had high shame and self-criticism. And that's kind of how compassion-focused therapy was developed. And this kind of makes sense to me when I think about some clients that I've worked with where you try to use like a cognitive restructuring approach. And, you know, like in order to be successful in the treatment, the goal is for them to be able to reevaluate or reframe their thoughts. And what if that isn't working for them? And then they actually feel like they're failing in that process, and that could actually increase their sense of shame. And so compassion is a really nice tool to have to be able to supplement other treatments. And I actually think that over time, what we'll see is not that there'll be these standalone approaches that are compassion-based, but that we'll see compassion integrated into other treatments in the way that we've seen mindfulness integrated into other treatments. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And I want to mention some of who I'm calling kind of the modern pioneers of compassion. And the reason I say this is modern pioneers is because the kind of history of compassion is built on thousands of years of contemplative and spiritual traditions. But on the left here is Kristen Neff, who's the creator of mindful self-compassion. And then on the right is Paul Gilbert, who's the creator of compassion-focused therapy. And then I included the Dalai Lama, not because he's a scientist or a practitioner, but he's somebody who has invested a lot of energy in supporting research around compassion and altruism. And he's also the representative of one of those spiritual traditions that has been focused on compassion for thousands of years. And I also wanted to kind of just highlight this book on the left-hand side here called, it's kind of a funny name, The ACT Practitioner's Guide to the Science of Compassion. So a really specific book for people like me who are interested in compassion, but it really was a great introduction, and a lot of the material in this presentation comes from it. And then just a shout out to Robin Walzer, who is somebody that I've done acceptance and commitment therapy training with. And the reason I mention her is because although she's not coming from a compassion-based background, the way that she works, and if you've ever been to a training with Robin Walzer, you'll know what this looks like, is really embodying compassion. And so I'm trying to present compassion as something that can be integrated into any treatment and something you can use fluidly, and doesn't mean you have to be like a CFT therapist to do it, for example, or a mindful self-compassion instructor. So let's talk a little bit about, from a scientific perspective, what we're talking about with compassion. So I'm going to talk a lot about evolution science in this presentation. And there's a reason for that, because compassion from a scientific perspective is understood to be a human capacity that has evolved from mammalian caregiving systems and attachment systems. And Paul Gilbert says that compassion provides a secure base for operating in the world, which has this kind of direct link to attachment. And I want you to think about it as not something that you just have, like, oh, I'm a compassionate person, but a skill that you can cultivate through intentional practice, and a skill that our clients can cultivate through intentional practice. And then self-compassion is kind of an extension of compassion. And so you can think of compassion as something that can flow two directions, in the direction of yourself and in the direction of other people. But in particular, self-compassion, which comes from the work of Kristen Neff, I'd like to make a distinction here between self-esteem and self-compassion. I think this illustrates some of these concepts nicely in terms of how this is a skill that you can train yourself around. So self-esteem, we can just define simply as seeing yourself highly. And the research shows that it's more dependent on external factors, particularly outcomes that, like being socially successful or being able to compare yourself favorably to other people. It's also associated with narcissism. It's not that self-esteem is a bad thing, but it seems to be contingent on these external factors that may not be within your control. Self-compassion, on the other hand, is a behavior of being kind to yourself, and it's a behavior that you can learn and practice, and it's associated with more stable sense of self-worth, autonomy, competence, and emotional intelligence. Also, it seems to be protective against developing anxiety and depression. So the really big, I think, takeaway here is that self-esteem is something that's nice to have if you have it, but hard to get if you don't have it, whereas self-compassion is something that anybody can practice and learn, and actually seems to be, if you're trying to work towards something, both more attainable, but probably more valuable. So maybe wondering what the definition of self-compassion is. This is, again, Kristen Neff's kind of basic definition. So it starts with the mindfulness of painful experiences such as sadness, loneliness, or anxiety. So again, note the role of mindfulness here, that you can't practice compassion without first slowing down, recognizing what you're experiencing, and taking in painful experiences. And then the second part being increased kindness and understanding in the face of painful experiences. And then this third part that is kind of unique to mindful self-compassion approach, which is called common humanity, a recognition that painful experiences are an inevitable part of the human condition. And so the way that I like to work with this with clients is to actually ask them to imagine all of the people in the world who are struggling with the same kind of thing that they're struggling with. That might be all of the people in the world who have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, or all of the people in the world, if we want to get really specific, who are a single parent who's dealing with the loss of a loved one. Like, we could get really specific, and there's still like so many people in this world who are at this moment even experiencing some of the same types of suffering that any of us are in any given moment. Another way to kind of illustrate this common humanity part of self-compassion that I use sometimes in experiential exercises is to ask clients to imagine a football stadium full of all people who are struggling with the same thing that they're struggling with. And again, even if it's pretty specific what they're struggling with, if we zoom out and think of the whole population of 7 billion people on the planet, there's probably quite a few, if not thousands or tens of thousands of people who could really relate to what they're struggling with. So I kind of want to introduce this kind of theme, or this kind of idea, which kind of runs throughout the rest of this presentation. And I'll read this slowly and ask you to try to take it in. Most of what causes us suffering is not within our control, is not of our choosing, and is not our fault. I'll invite you to just take that in one more time. Most of what causes us suffering is not within our control, is not of our choosing, and is not our fault. And I was giving a version of this talk a few weeks ago to a group of ACT therapists, and somebody asked me a really good question about this. They said, coming from an ACT perspective and some other approaches like DBT, we talk about suffering as something where you do have choice. And the idea there is that pain is an inevitable part of life, and that suffering happens when we bring resistance or unwillingness or willfulness to experiences of pain, basically non-acceptance. And maybe people are familiar with that formula of suffering equals pain times resistance. And so I think it's worth mentioning here that the kind of suffering that I'm talking about here is a little bit different. Certainly from a compassion-focused perspective, you could certainly talk about the difference between pain and suffering and where your choice exists and how you are relating to the painful experiences in your life. But what I'm talking about here is really how our conditioning as humans contributes to the ways in which we suffer, and that how many of the forces that shaped us were outside of our control. And that's kind of how we get into some of the science of compassion. So you may be wondering what's in our control. And I like to just state this up front because I'm going to talk about a lot of things that are out of our control. So we have choice about how we want to show up in the world. We have choice about how we want to respond to challenging situations and experiences. We can make the choice to learn new skills and expand our perspective. We can make the choice to direct compassion toward ourselves and toward others. And then this last one, which I think is kind of interesting, we can intentionally get in touch with the fact that we are part of the ongoing flow of life on our planet. And this maybe seem like kind of a weird thing to say, especially in like an evidence-based therapy context. And I think I'll try to explain this, but I think part of this is recognizing that as humans, we're part of a species that has not always been around and will not always be around, and that we're shaped by these biological forces that are largely outside of our control. And that like there's only so much we can do about that, and we're kind of working within that system. And that there's going to be inevitably suffering that's part of our life, kind of knowing that our lives are going to come to an end. Our species' lives, or the life of our species is going to come to an end at some point as well. So before I get too deep into the evolutionary part of this talk, I do want to present this, what's called the sometimes called the 3 circles of CFT, or the CFT model of emotion regulation. And some people may be familiar with this. The basic premise here is that there's these 3 kind of core parts of our nervous system. And this isn't, I want to state up front, this is kind of an oversimplification. This is something that's designed for clients to kind of take in and understand, and it's simplifying some very complicated biological processes here. But the first one here is the drive system, which is associated with goal-oriented behavior, getting our needs met, right? Like getting food or resources for your family, associated with wanting, pursuing, achieving, consuming, associated with the hormone dopamine, and feelings of being motivated, driven, excited. So when I think about the drive system, I think about, from an evolutionary perspective, hunting and getting food for your family, building your shelter, doing the things that you need to do to survive, not necessarily in a threat context, but these things are things that you need to do in order to be successful and to live a successful life. And if I think about this in a modern context, I think about all of us on our Zoom meetings, ticking away at like our therapy sessions or getting our notes done, right? Like doing the things that we need to do to feed and support our families. So this is obviously an important part of human behavior, is like this goal-oriented drive, but it's one part of this system. And then the next one is the threat system. I think everyone here is probably familiar. This is just different language for our fight or flight, freeze response. And its function is related to managing threats, keeping us safe, survival from threats, and associated with the hormone cortisol, and associated with feelings of anxiety, anger, disgust, sadness, shame. And then the third one, and this is really where compassion comes in, is the soothing system, also known as the rest and digest system. It's when we slow down, we cultivate a sense of safeness and kindness, and it's associated with the hormone oxytocin and feelings of being content, safe, and connected. So from a CFT perspective, these are all important parts of our human functioning, but what can happen is that we can end up spending an imbalanced amount of our time in our drive or threat systems and really neglect our soothing system. So sometimes think about this like sometimes we treat different approaches. So, all of us, I think probably as therapists and mental health practitioners probably talk in some way about the fight or flight system or the threat system with our clients. And then we offer tools or strategies that they can use when they find themselves activated in this way. And I think sometimes we focus this like when your threat system is activated, here's a skill or something that you can use. Kind of like when you have a headache, here's a Tylenol that you can take. And the way that I think compassion-based approaches are encouraging us to think about this is more like, rather than compassion and soothing behaviors being something that we do, only when we need to, like taking a Tylenol, to think of them more like taking our vitamins, like something that we want to do on a regular basis, and that by cultivating balance in our nervous system, we can achieve better psychological and physical well-being. So let's see if this is resonating with people at all. So I actually have a quick poll here, and I'm going to unshare my screen, and I'm going to put into the chat this link. Hopefully this is going to work. Somebody let me know if you're able to access this. And what I'm asking you to do is to rate over the past year what percentage of the time you've spent with each of these three systems engaged. And so you are going to put a percentage for each one: drive, threat, and soothing, but those percentages should add up to 100%. Any questions about this poll? Okay. And if you want to just take a moment to fill it out, then I'm going to show, this is the first time I'm using this system, so hopefully it's going to work. I'm going to be able to display the results here. Okay. So it looks like, so these numbers here represent 0 to 100% basically. So about the average for this group is about 50% of time spent in drive, about 36% of time spent, hopefully this all adds up to 100%, about 37% of the time spent in, but you can see there's a wide variety, like some people almost 0, some people up as high as like 70%, but about on average, like 30 to 40% of time spent in threat. And then, and this is always, I've done this presentation a few times in different ways. I used a different way of measuring the poll, but it always is the case that soothing is the least. People have spent the least amount of time with their soothing system engaged. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, like we're just living through a pandemic, right? So people are afraid for their health, they're afraid for the health of their families and for their patients. And everybody has been dealing with this different way of living and working, still trying to meet our basic needs, continuing to work with our drive system engaged, kind of pushing, like drive and threat at the same time, pushing through all of the dangers that are existing in our world and all of the chaos that's going on. And I think what it shows is that basically all of us could benefit from spending more time cultivating compassion for ourselves and engaging this caretaking, soothing part of our nervous system. I mentioned attachment, and people I'm sure are familiar with Mary Ainsworth, who's a developmental psychologist that studied attachment using the strange situation assessment, where you put a young child in the situation where they would have a stranger walk into the room and see how they reacted when this strange person came in. And what this, as everybody probably knows, showed is that secure attachment gives the infant the ability to explore their environment and try new things, even in the face of something new or uncertain. Whereas children with insecure attachment are going to likely kind of hide or cling or be distant and not be as flexible to explore their environment. And this is more than just a metaphor for compassion. Really, the science of compassion, or at least what I'm presenting here today, kind of posits that this is the same biological processes in many ways that contribute to compassion, and that compassion gives us this flexibility to face the world and to navigate difficult and challenging circumstances. So let's get into a little bit about, from our evolutionary history, why this is the case. So in the CFT model, there are kind of three roots of our suffering that are proposed. Suffering that's rooted in our evolutionary history, suffering that's rooted in our personal history, and suffering that's rooted in the present moment. And I think out of these, the ones rooted in our evolutionary history are really compelling. And if people are familiar with dialectical behavioral therapy, biosocial theory, this I think is really similar. I think it's actually a really nice complement to biosocial theory in DBT. So I want to start with this quote here from Alan Watts. We do not come into this world, we come out of it, as leaves from a tree. As the ocean waves, the universe peoples. Every individual is an expression of the whole realm of nature, a unique action of the total universe. So when I think about this quote, I think about the fact that we all find ourselves here on this planet with a brain and in a body that we didn't choose, and we're preceded by billions of years of existence, and we know that humans will not exist forever. All of us are mortal, and all of us will experience decline, and we're deeply shaped by the forces of evolution. And all humans face struggles related to these facts. So the human brain is the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And as we all know, in evolution, when something is working, it tends to get replicated. So many of the brain structures that we have as humans are quite similar to, or were built on, structures that started hundreds of millions of years ago with fish and reptiles. And so if we look at this kind of evolutionary history of the human brain here, we can see that fish and reptiles have been around for like 500 million years. And these animals were, these kind of behaviors that define these kinds of animals are territorial, defensive, reproductive, and food-seeking behaviors. So basically fighting, mating, and getting food. Those are like the main things that these species do, and they don't do a lot other than that. And then mammals have been around for something like 200 million years. And you see with mammals that they start to live in groups, and they engage in nurturing and caretaking behaviors. They have more alliances, and you actually see play in ways that you don't see with reptiles. And then primates have been around maybe like 50 million years, and they're even more social, emotional, and cooperative. And then humans have been around, depending on how you define humans, but like a few 100,000 years or 100,000 years. We're the most social species of all. We have these really big advanced brains, but our brains are built on these more kind of old, in CFT as you would call them, old brain structures that come from our ancient relatives. And what's interesting about humans is that we have such big brains that we can't continue to develop in utero. So we have to be born at this really vulnerable stage. And then we have the longest developmental period of any species. So we have this long period of humans as children of being vulnerable. We can't take care of ourselves, and we need our caretakers and our group to protect us. And this is where the kind of role of compassion comes into play. So from a scientific perspective, the idea here is that we developed these affiliative caretaking behaviors, a way of soothing the nervous system in order to communicate when we're in these groups of people that you're safe. Because we live, we evolved in this world where there were lots of dangers and lots of threats, and we needed a way to communicate that there's a sense of safety. And so as we're trying to activate our, if we're trying to activate our caretaking, soothing system, we're trying to communicate that we're safe and we're not in danger, because we have these brains that are wired in such a way that our threat systems can get activated even in situations in which there really is no danger. So compassion is really about slowing down and connecting and communicating safety. And this is just kind of an interesting little tidbit. So I talked about the old brain. And then in CFT, we talk about what's called like the new brain, right? The more advanced part of our brain. And this book here, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, which is a really interesting book. The author, Yuval Harari, talks about how did humans make this jump from being hunter-gatherers to living in agrarian societies? How did we go from living in these really small groups of humans that were not that much different than primate groups that you see today? It's pretty small, focused on living off the land, hunting and gathering, right? To large agrarian societies of thousands of people where we had big cities and thousands of people living together. And the kind of hypothesis that Yuval Harari makes is that it was the development of language that facilitated our ability to live in these large groups. And there's some research that shows primatologists have studied primate groups and seen that primate groups don't tend to get bigger than a few hundred. And one of the theories for why that is because there's actually like not enough space in their brain to track all of the different relationships. And so primates have relationships in these groups that are based on remembering all of the different individuals. And can I trust that individual? Am I safe with that individual? And humans, we developed other ways of living in large groups where we couldn't, there's no way you could know in a city of 10,000 people, you could know everybody in that city. And it was, in particular, he says that we developed the ability to tell stories based on myths and to use symbolic language. And the two main things that he focuses on in this book are the development of religion, which is stories that we tell using symbolic language to tell stories about how we should cooperate. You know, religion has all these rules about how you should and shouldn't behave. And then money, which money is basically a physical object that has a symbolic property that allows us to organize an economy around it. And so basically the idea here is that these big advanced brains that we developed as humans, we developed the ability to use symbolic language in particular, allowed us to thrive and advance as a species, but we still have the old brain. So we have the new brain that has made us so successful as a species, but we also have this old brain wiring. And so let's think a little bit about that for a second. So let's take the emotion of shame as an example. So shame from an evolutionary perspective is an emotion that tells us that we're at risk of being rejected or kicked out of the group. And I want you to think about this for a second. I want you to imagine, this is a little bit different in the virtual world, but imagine that you're at work and you are hungry and you don't have anything for lunch. And so you go and you open up the fridge at work and you see your coworker has a sandwich and you look around and nobody's there and you choose to steal your coworker's sandwich and then you get caught. Like imagine getting caught stealing your coworker's food. Imagine how you would be feeling. Probably a lot of shame. Now imagine 10,000 years ago you get caught stealing food from your group. What do you think would have happened? Probably you would have been kicked out of the group. And as a human, you probably wouldn't have been able to survive on your own. So shame from an evolutionary perspective really tells us about, it kind of gets down to this fear of death in a sense, like fear of being kicked out of the group and a fear of death, which kind of makes sense, right? Like don't steal food from your hunter-gatherer group. That makes sense. And that's a behavior from an evolutionary perspective that was really adaptive. We don't want that. It's not good for the group to survive. But think about it in the modern context, all of the things that cause us shame today. Like we feel shame about our bodies. We feel shame about how hard we're working. We feel shame about the fact that we have emotions themselves. All of these things can trigger this emotional response that's kind of deeply rooted in our evolutionary history in a way that is maybe different than, the evolutionary context is very different. And so this in CFT is kind of what's called tricky brain. This idea that the new parts of our brain, particularly those that involve language and symbolic language, can activate the old parts of our brain, like our threat system. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to do a little exercise in a second. But kind of to summarize this, we know that like these advanced capabilities of our brain led to us being really successful as a species. But at the core of the kind of CFT model is this idea that there's this kind of double-edged sword to these big, powerful, advanced brains that we have. And that by our ability to engage in symbolic thought, where we can think about things that aren't here, we can tell stories about things that aren't, we don't have to just physically interact with objects that are directly in front of us. We can interact with things that are imaginary. And that actually doing that, like imagining something painful or difficult or something scary, can actually activate part of our brain that was designed to protect us against threats. So to illustrate this, I actually want to ask this question of the group. And if you're willing to share in the chat, go ahead and just enter into the chat. So there's basically 13 items here. And just read through these. And if they're true for you, just count up all the ones that are true and then put the number in the chat. So have you ever ruminated on from the past an embarrassing mistake, a missed opportunity, something that you lost? Have you ever ruminated about how things could have been different, or why you didn't figure it all out sooner, or where you went wrong? Or have you ever worried about in the future losing your job, dying, getting sick, going bankrupt, making the wrong choice, or worried about losing something you love or not getting something you want? So just take a moment. These add up to 13. So just count the number and put it in the chat. Okay, so 12, 13, all of them, all but maybe 12 and a half, says Bart. Okay, so everybody's done basically all of these. This is like a very uniquely human thing. Only humans can do these things. And other animals cannot ruminate on the past or worry about the future. Other animals basically live in the present moment. So it's great as humans that we have the ability to live in the past and to live in the future, and to do this in ways that's really vivid, right? Using our powerful brains to imagine things in really vivid detail, to relive memories in ways that are really vivid. But it also, as you can see here, causes a lot of suffering. And here's another one. Have you ever worried about something bad from your past happening again in your future? Again, another uniquely human thing. So when I talk about the evolutionary roots of our suffering, our really big, powerful brains are really where a lot of our suffering comes from. Okay, so moving on to the personal roots of our suffering. Here's some kind of basic ideas. The start of your existence was not up to you. You didn't choose to be thrown into this world. You were kind of born without your consent. You didn't choose your family, your socioeconomic status, your geography. You didn't choose your biology, your DNA, or your early childhood life experiences. And this is something I'm positing, so if you think it's not true, let me know. But I would posit that your most challenging and persistent emotional experiences are embedded in the unique history or unique circumstances of your personal history. And to illustrate this, this is a metaphor that's kind of I've adapted, but this comes from CFT. So imagine that you had grown up in a house down the road, and you could imagine that, like, at the hospital you were switched at birth, right? And so instead of going to your family's home, you ended up going to some other family's home. So you ended up with different parents, you went to different schools, you had different friends, you had different challenges and opportunities, and you had different traumas in your life. How much about the kind of suffering that you have in your life would be different? Now, I'm not saying that you wouldn't have suffering, because all humans experience suffering in different ways, but how much of the content of your suffering would be different? How much of it is tied up in your relationships with your parents or people that you've known for many years, like your siblings or your friends or your spouses, or experiences that you had in school, or all these things that you didn't choose about your life? And is it possible, if that's true, if this resonates for you, to cultivate a greater sense of compassion, that all of these things, or many of these things that you're struggling with, are not only just about being a human who has a big brain and has all of this kind of biology that makes it hard to be a human, as we talked about in the previous section, but also who has your unique personal history, and that you didn't choose to have all of these things in your life that contain elements of suffering. And so this is actually a quote here from Steve Hayes, who's, this is how I talked about bringing in acceptance and commitment therapy. That's my background. Steve Hayes is the co-founder of ACT. We hurt where we care, and we care where we hurt, is this kind of core idea from ACT that I think really relates nicely to what we're talking about here with compassion, which is that these areas of our life that bring up a lot of painful stuff are also probably the areas where we have the most meaningful, relationships. Not always. Sometimes some of these relationships maybe are kind of all bad or all negative, but a lot of the areas where we have the most anxiety or shame or distress are around relationships and other things that really matter a lot to us. So the third kind of root of our suffering from a CFT perspective is, so we have suffering that's rooted in our evolutionary history, suffering that's rooted in our personal history, and then suffering that's rooted in the present moment. And so these are just some ideas. None of this is going to be kind of mind-blowing or groundbreaking for you all, but locating suffering in the present moment, looking out for shame, self-criticism, blame, and judgment. And in particularly around self-criticism, what's interesting, so remember how I was talking about the old brain, so the new brain activating the old brain, right? Well, self-criticism is largely a language process. So this is involving these kind of advanced human brain that we have. There's some research and that shows that when we're engaged in self-criticism, we're actually activating parts of our threat system in the same way that they would be activated if we were being bullied by other people. So there's some like fMRI research that shows this, which is kind of really interesting, right? So when we're engaging in like, gosh, like I'm so bad at that, or I'm such a failure, or I need to do better, that kind of way of talking to ourselves, that we're actively activating the part of our brain that was designed to be activated when other people are threatening us, which is kind of weird. Like maybe that makes you think a little bit different about our kind of tendency many of us have to engage in habitual self-criticism. So these are just some tips. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just some ways to start to practice compassionate self-validation. And this is kind of meant to be rooted in those different areas of our suffering. It makes sense that I feel this way because I've had a hard week, or as a human, I care a lot about being connected to others, or I did something that went against my values, or I was reminded of something painful from my past, or feeling anxious as part of being human. And there's many more different ways that you could validate yourself around, that when I think about traumatic memories, my threat system is being activated as if I was right there and the trauma was happening to me again, right? And so can change your experience of a difficult emotion or memory or thought to put it in the context of being a human with our biology, for example. So before we wrap up, I want to take a few minutes to kind of offer an example of an exercise that comes from something that I've adapted from compassion-focused therapy. And this is really about cultivating a more compassionate version of yourself. So I'm going to invite everyone, if you're willing to participate in this. It's kind of an eyes closed exercise. If you'd like, you're welcome to turn off your camera. It should take about 5 minutes. So starting out, I'll invite you to find a posture that feels comfortable, upright, and relaxed. And it can be helpful to straighten your spine, but also allow your shoulders to kind of loosen, the muscles in your jaw to loosen. And you can close your eyes or let your gaze drift downward. So allowing your attention to settle into this moment, take a moment to trace the flow of your breath, breathing in and breathing out. Noticing little details like the gentle rise and fall of your chest as your lungs expand and contract, or the subtle difference in temperature between the air that you breathe in and the air that you breathe out. Just connecting with the gentle rhythm and flow of your breath. So I'll invite you to bring to mind one area in which you tend to be hard on yourself. Maybe this is something you're pushing yourself to do better at, or maybe you're beating yourself up for making a mistake. And I'll invite you to examine the way in which you talk to yourself about this, including the words you use, any harsh language or unrealistic expectations, as well as the tone, so the way in which you talk to yourself. So just bring to mind this hard thing and how you tend to relate to yourself, and whether there's this kind of self-critical or harsh quality. And then I'm going to invite you to kind of put that aside for a second and bring to mind somebody who you feel close to, somebody who makes you feel safe. Maybe somebody you look up to. So take a moment to bring to mind this person. And what are the qualities that this person has? This safe, kind person. Are they compassionate, kind, supportive? Are they strong and wise? Any other qualities that come to mind about this person? And next, I want you to imagine yourself with all of these same qualities. So take a few moments to really construct a version of yourself that is deeply compassionate and kind. And even if you can't relate to this version of yourself, imagine that you're an actor playing this as a role, and really try to step into the role. So take a few moments to imagine this compassionate version of yourself. And then coming back to this area of self-criticism or judgment from the beginning, can you relate any differently to yourself around this challenge? If you could embody this more compassionate version of yourself, how might you relate to this challenge? Do you want to offer yourself any kind words or gestures of support? Or some kind of physical embrace, like placing your hand on your heart? Or simply saying, you're doing your best, or I'm doing my best. So just spending another moment offering some compassion for yourself. And then I'll invite you to connect back to the gentle rhythm and flow of your breath. Take a few more deep breaths. And as you're ready, bring your awareness back to your surrounding and open your eyes. So just for the sake of time, I'm not gonna spend much time with this, but these are just some questions here in the slides. And if you want to reflect on this later, what did you notice about the qualities of your compassionate self? And did you find yourself relating any differently to yourself in this challenging issue while embodying this more compassionate version of yourself? And kind of to think about how might your relationship to your difficult thoughts and feelings change if you could more regularly cultivate your compassionate self. And so this kind of exercise is the kind that in these evidence-based models like compassion-focused therapy and compassionate mind training, if you did something like this every day for a few weeks, you might find yourself really changing the way that you're relating to yourself. And this has been applied, widely applied, from everything to what you might have chosen around a personal issue or anxiety or self-criticism or relationship issue to things like eating disorders and psychosis. Actually wanted to mention, I forgot to mention that there's a video that I can share in the chat called Compassion for Voices that comes from the UK. It's like an animated video that shows that 3-circle model of the 3 circles of emotion regulation. And that was developed for people with auditory hallucinations. And I find that to be a really compelling video that I've shared with a lot of clients, and it is a nice illustration of the CFT model as well. So I'm going to skip over this slide and just kind of bring us to our end so that we can have some time for discussion. But I just kind of wanted to leave us. I talked a lot about how our new brains can trigger our threat system by engaging with imagined fears and ruminating on our, things from our past, or thinking about terrible things that might happen. But I also want to end on how we can actually take our innate capacity for compassion and caring and also channel this through our big, powerful brains. So we're the only species on the planet that can care about individuals that we've never met. We can care about people halfway across the world. We can care about this fate of our species and our planet, and we can think about this abstract concept of our future as well. And each of us has chosen to make our life work about caring and compassion for others. And we really live in a world of suffering and injustice. So here we have scenes of forest fires in California and refugee camps and overflowing ICUs and protests against racial injustice. And we seem to have like a never-ending supply of suffering. And yet I believe that there's a never-ending human capacity for compassion, that our capacity for compassion is expansive, and it's something that we can choose to cultivate and spread. So I want to leave you with an invitation to cultivate compassion for yourself, for others, and for our world. I'm going to stop there. I haven't looked at the chat for a while, so I don't know if there's questions.
Well, we have a few minutes. Thank you so much for this, Shane. And one question that came to mind was the use of homework between sessions and how that looks with this approach to therapy.
Yeah, like what homework for this looks like?
Yeah, like if you give patients homework and
so like that kind of exercise that I gave is a good example of one thing that might be homework, which is like practicing a sense of like some kind of practice around cultivating compassion. And both in mindful self-compassion and compassion-focused therapy, there's a lot of different exercises, kind of ranging from the really basic, which are like very similar to maybe other kinds of breathing techniques, but often with this emphasis on compassion-based approaches is on like soothing breathing, and there's something called soothing rhythm breathing and CFT, kind of ranging from that, starting out really more basic, just connecting to your body, and in mindful self-compassion, there's exercises around just using touch, like affectionate touch, like putting your hand on your heart, putting your hand on your thighs, things like that. And then kind of building scaffolding up from there to, I'd say the exercise that I did is like a little bit more advanced probably of an exercise, because it's asking you to do this kind of perspective taking, imagining somebody that you look up to or somebody that you find to be safe, and then imagining yourself with those qualities. But that's kind of the direction that a lot of these exercises head, is kind of helping you find different ways to cultivate a greater sense of compassion. But then I think homework can also be really broad too. Like those are the direct kind of skills that you might practice to cultivate greater compassion. But also there's been like studies on compassion-focused exposure and response prevention. So you could do like compassion skills training as kind of a foundation for, and then you might have somebody with OCD or somebody with social anxiety or whatever they need exposure for, where the homework is actually to go out and do the exposures, just like a traditional exposure and response prevention might look like. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what different homeworks might look like. I did get a question in a direct message about somebody said that I mentioned Yuval Harari's book, and I got a comment about how some of what I said about Harari and the Hunters and Gatherers has been challenged by another author who I'm not familiar with, but a book or a publication called The Dawn of Everything. So just wanted to thank that person. And I think that when we're talking about evolutionary psychology, I'm not an expert in evolutionary psychology. I find these ideas to be really compelling and interesting in forming treatment approaches, but also I think evolutionary psychology, just what I know about it is it's really hard to prove these theories, right? Because we're making theories about things that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. I think that the basic idea about compassion and its relationship to attachment and caregiving, I don't think that that's really in question. But I appreciate the comment about, and I'll check out The Dawn of Everything. Any other questions or thoughts?
Someone asked if you have a website, Shane.
I don't, but maybe I should get one. And I just wanted to mention, I see a few former colleagues here, so I wanted to say hi to them.
Well, we're just at the top of the hour. I think we'll go ahead and conclude. Once again, thank you, everybody. And thank you, especially Shane, and everyone have a good and safe Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.
Thank you.